Imagine walking through a jungle where the air is so thick you can barely breathe. Every step sinks into wet earth. Vines hang from ancient trees. Insects buzz around your ears. Somewhere in the distance, thunder rolls across the mountains. Then, through the wall of green, you see something that shouldn't be there. A wing. You push aside the vegetation. Then you see the cockpit. The engine. The unmistakable shape of a fighter aircraft. A Brewster Buffalo. A machine built for war nearly a century ago, now swallowed by the jungle. For decades, the aircraft had been almost completely forgotten. No museum displayed it. No mechanic maintained it. No pilot climbed into its cockpit. Nature had slowly claimed it, covering its metal skin with vines and leaves until the airplane became part of the forest itself. But the Buffalo was never supposed to become a jungle ghost. When it first appeared, the Brewster F2A Buffalo represented something entirely different. It was America's first modern monoplane fighter to enter U.S. Navy service. It was fast, compact, and heavily armed for its time. With its enclosed cockpit, retractable landing gear, and powerful radial engine, the Buffalo looked like the future of aerial warfare. But history is rarely kind to machines that arrive at the wrong moment. By the time the Second World War reached the Pacific, the Buffalo found itself facing an enemy that was rapidly changing the rules of air combat. Japanese fighters were faster, more maneuverable, and flown by pilots with extensive combat experience. The Buffalo would soon earn a reputation as an underdog. But that reputation has often overshadowed the men who actually flew it. Because behind every aircraft was a pilot. A young man sitting alone inside a cramped cockpit, thousands of feet above the ground, knowing that somewhere beyond the clouds, enemy fighters could be waiting. For some Buffalo pilots, the airplane was not a death sentence. It was their only chance. They fought with what they had. They attacked when they were ordered to attack. They defended airfields, escorted bombers, and climbed into skies where survival could depend on a few seconds of reaction time. And when the fighting ended, many of these aircraft simply disappeared. Some were destroyed in combat. Others were abandoned on remote airfields. And some vanished into the vast wilderness of Southeast Asia and the Pacific. One of them would become a true jungle ghost. Hidden beneath a canopy that had witnessed the war itself, the forgotten fighter waited year after year. Rain fell across its wings. Roots pushed into the earth beneath it. Vines wrapped around its fuselage. The world changed. The soldiers went home. The war became history. And the Buffalo remained. But then, decades later, someone found it. And suddenly, the jungle was no longer silent. The discovery raised a question that had been waiting for generations. How did a World War II fighter disappear into the wilderness? And what happened to the people who flew it? This is the story of the Brewster Buffalo. A story of war, survival, mystery, and a forgotten machine that refused to completely disappear. To understand the mystery of the jungle Buffalo, we have to go back to the years before the Pacific War exploded into full-scale conflict. During the 1930s, military aviation was changing at extraordinary speed. The era of fabric-covered biplanes was disappearing. In their place came sleek, all-metal monoplanes with enclosed cockpits, retractable landing gear, and powerful engines. The Brewster Buffalo was born during this transition. Its design was compact and modern. The pilot sat inside an enclosed cockpit, protected from the elements. The aircraft carried machine guns and was built to operate from aircraft carriers as well as land bases. For its time, it was an impressive machine. But war does not care about yesterday's impressive technology. By 1941, the Buffalo was being sent into combat in some of the most dangerous places on Earth. The Pacific and Southeast Asian theaters presented pilots with a terrifying combination of challenges. Tropical weather, long distances, poor navigation, limited intelligence, and an enemy that had already gained valuable combat experience in China. When Japanese forces launched their offensives across the Pacific, Buffalo squadrons found themselves fighting under impossible conditions. Some aircraft were outnumbered. Some bases were attacked before pilots could even take off. Others were forced to operate from primitive airfields surrounded by jungle. The Buffalo's greatest weakness became obvious. It could not always compete with newer Japanese fighters in a traditional dogfight. But that doesn't mean its pilots simply gave up. They adapted. They learned to avoid certain situations. They used teamwork. They attacked when they had the advantage, and they relied on discipline to survive. For the men flying these aircraft, every mission could be their last. Imagine sitting inside that cockpit. The engine roars to life. The propeller becomes a blur. The aircraft begins moving across a rough airstrip. Ahead is nothing but jungle and sky. Then the Buffalo lifts into the air. For a few moments, everything seems peaceful. But somewhere beyond the horizon, enemy aircraft may already be approaching. A warning comes over the radio. Pilots look upward. And suddenly the sky is filled with aircraft. In moments like these, technical specifications become meaningless. The pilot has only instinct, training, and courage. Some Buffalo pilots fought until their ammunition was gone. Others returned with aircraft riddled with bullet holes. And some never returned at all. As the war moved forward, the Buffalo gradually disappeared from frontline service. Newer fighters replaced it. The legendary machines of the later war, aircraft like the Spitfire, Mustang, Hellcat, and Corsair, became symbols of Allied air power. The Buffalo was increasingly forgotten. But in remote corners of the world, some examples remained. And this is where the story becomes mysterious. Deep in the tropical wilderness, aircraft could disappear remarkably quickly. A crashed fighter didn't need to be recovered. There were no roads, no cranes, no helicopters capable of simply lifting the wreckage away. Instead, the jungle took over. First came the rain, then the vines, then the roots. The aircraft slowly vanished beneath layers of vegetation. A machine that had once screamed through the sky at hundreds of miles per hour became almost invisible. To anyone passing nearby, it might look like nothing more than an ordinary patch of jungle. But underneath the leaves was history. A cockpit where a pilot had once sat. A propeller that had once turned thousands of times per minute. A machine that had once carried a human being into combat. And then one day someone found it. The discovery of a forgotten Buffalo transformed the aircraft from a forgotten relic into a historical mystery. The question was no longer simply what happened to the airplane. The question became, who flew it? Was the pilot killed? Did they survive? Was the aircraft forced down? Was it abandoned? Or had it simply been left behind when the war moved elsewhere? Every scratch on the metal seemed to tell part of the story. Every missing panel created another question. The jungle had preserved the machine, but it had not preserved the answers. And perhaps that is what makes the Buffalo so fascinating. It is not simply an aircraft. It is a doorway into a forgotten world. A world where young pilots climbed into fragile machines and disappeared into skies filled with enemies. A world where some returned home as heroes, and others became names lost to history. The Buffalo waited silently through all of it, until someone finally came looking. Today, when we look at photographs of the Brewster Buffalo, it is easy to judge the aircraft by its reputation. Too slow, too vulnerable, outclassed, forgotten. But history is rarely that simple. An airplane is only as good as the circumstances in which it is asked to fight. And the Buffalo was often asked to fight a war it had never been designed to face. Its pilots were sent into battles against experienced opponents, frequently under terrible conditions and with limited support. Yet they climbed into those aircraft anyway. That is the part of the story that should never be forgotten. Because when the engine started, the pilot inside the cockpit didn't care about the aircraft's reputation. He cared about getting home. He cared about the man flying beside him. He cared about completing the mission. And sometimes, despite overwhelming odds, they succeeded. The Jungle Buffalo represents something larger than the story of one fighter. It represents the thousands of aircraft that disappeared after the Second World War. Some were buried beneath the ocean. Some were swallowed by deserts. Others disappeared into mountains. And some were consumed by jungles that seemed almost determined to erase every trace of the conflict. But the jungle is strange. It destroys. Yet sometimes, it preserves. Under layers of vegetation, metal can survive. And when that metal is finally uncovered, it brings the past rushing back. Suddenly, the war doesn't feel like something that happened in a history book. You can see the aircraft. You can imagine the engine running. You can picture the pilot climbing into the cockpit. You can almost hear the radio crackling with instructions. And you realize that the people who flew these machines were not legends when they first climbed aboard. They were young men. They had families. They had fears. They had dreams. Then history placed them inside a fighter and sent them into the sky. The Brewster Buffalo story is therefore not really about an aircraft that lost a battle. It is about the people who fought with what they had. It is about courage under impossible circumstances. And it is about how easily history can forget. For decades, the jungle kept its secret. Rain fell. Trees grew. Generations passed. The world moved on. But beneath the green canopy, the buffalo remained. Silent. Forgotten. Waiting. And when it was finally discovered, it gave the world one more chance to remember. Not just the aircraft. Not just the battles. But the pilots. The mechanics. The ground crews. And everyone whose lives were changed by the war. Today, the Brewster Buffalo may no longer dominate the skies. It may never receive the same fame as the Spitfire or the Mustang. But perhaps that is exactly why its story matters. Because history isn't only made by the machines that became famous. Sometimes, the most fascinating stories belong to the forgotten ones. The aircraft that disappeared. The pilots whose names faded. The wreckage hidden beneath the jungle. And the mysteries that survived long after the war ended. So the next time you see an old photograph of a Brewster Buffalo, don't just see an obsolete fighter. See the jungle. See the cockpit. See the young pilot preparing for another mission. And remember that somewhere, beneath the vines and forgotten earth, the past may still be waiting. Because some ghosts never truly disappear. They simply wait for someone to find them. And the Brewster Buffalo was one of those ghosts.